The topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart.
Hello and welcome to It's Your Voice, the show that hosts enriching conversations in diversity and in climate change. We're having a wonderful series on climate change and climate solutions with people who've put a lot of time and thinking and effort into finding ways to build climate resilience. Before I introduce my guest today, I just want to mention that my name is Bahia and I have a website if you're interested in looking at what I teach as a diversity educator and a core alignment coach. I support organizations and individuals to learn how to acknowledge, recognize patterns of bias and step out of them and cultivate new patterns that will replace those to make life more inclusive and create more belonging for everyone, which genuinely creates more happiness for everyone around. So today the show is called Change the Story, Change the World. And my guest is Garth Lindley. Garth, why don't you come on out and join me while I read a little bit of a snapshot of your introduction and biography so that I get the words right and you can add anything you want. But welcome. Thank you for being here.
Sure. Glad to.
So Garth Lindley is passionate about the environment and has self-educated himself about climate change and how it is a culmination of all the ways in which we are not living in the boundaries of Earth. He enjoys the outdoors, and in his 20s, Garth got involved with watershed organizations by showing up to one too many trash cleanups and was invited to join the board. Since then, he has learned more about nature and how to restore balance to our world. He's gotten involved with many environmental nonprofits and worked professionally for environmental organizations. Garth attended Al Gore's Climate Reality Project training in 2017 and took several years after that to find a way to succinctly illustrate the human, not just the technical, issues around climate change. I really appreciate you being here today. I got to see your a slideshow presentation that you made at a school not that long ago. And before you begin, I wanted to let the listeners and viewers know that rather than a conversation which we normally have, I really want to dedicate this majority of the show to Garth showing a slideshow, which he'll describe so that listeners can hear the concepts of each slide, and then we'll wrap up in the end. But Garth, anything you want to add or tell us before you start your great story about how you're helping change the world?
No, I appreciate that introduction. That was great. The only thing I would add is that I just am happy to be here and happy to share this message. So if we could go ahead and pull up the slideshow, that'd be great. Okay, so for all the listeners and viewers, if you could just take a second and hopefully either on your phone or on a piece of paper or something like that, write down 2 or 3 problems in the world that you're most concerned about. And we're going to use this for at the end of the presentation. So just be thinking about that. If you can't think about it right now, you can do that as we go along through the presentation. So the reason I named this Change the Story, Change the World will become apparent as I go through the slides here. And so be thinking about those problems that you're most concerned about in the world, and we will revisit that here towards the end of the presentation. So, as Bahia mentioned, I trained with Al Gore in 2017 in Denver with the Climate Reality Project. This is a project that he started sometime shortly after he was no longer vice president. And so I will share with folks that, if anybody's seen An Inconvenient Truth 1 or 2, this is very different from what Al Gore shared during those movies. This is just a different concept about climate change and where I believe that the true problems are coming from. So before I start, I do want to acknowledge that these ideas that I'm sharing are not new ideas necessarily. They've been understood by indigenous people and people of color for a very long time. However, I have the power and privilege as a white male, which is why I must speak up. And with power comes responsibility. Also, the more voices, the better. So I believe this is an all-in problem. So this isn't just for one group necessarily to solve. Um, so my hope for this presentation, one of the reasons I asked you to write down a couple of problems that you're concerned about, is because I want you to come away from this presentation feeling empowered and working towards a change in the things that really matter. I kind of jokingly say that, the folks that are concerned about climate change, concerned about the environment, so many times we worry about which bin the plastic cup goes in rather than worrying about what the true problems are. So I want you to come away from this feeling empowered to do and concentrate on the things that are most impactful. Yes, absolutely put the cup in the right bin, but let's concentrate on the things that truly matter as well. So I believe our society is out of balance with life on Earth, which is causing catastrophic climate change. So for those of you that are just listening, that's what my next slide says. Um, So we can see the symptoms of climate change in floods, in fires, in rising sea levels. We can see all those symptoms, but the symptoms show us that there's a lack of balance around the societal issues that we have. And so I believe that the incentives are wrong, and we're making the wrong making choices that are not in harmony with the constraints of natural systems. So the proof is in that we're using fossil fuels, we're creating waste, and we base everything on short-term thinking. And so we're trying to solve our problems based on our economic system rather than our natural systems. Our economic system is a man-made concept or a human-made concept, and that can be changed. And I'll talk a little more about that here in a little bit too. So I realize that climate change is really just a symptom of our crisis of our relationship with the earth and one another. And then as I thought about it more, I realized that my hometown of Kingwood, West Virginia is a tangible example of that broken relationship. So, for those of you just listening, my next slide is a picture of my hometown of Kingwood, West Virginia. There's two pictures there of our downtown, and I'll use air quotes for that because it's a very small downtown. This was a town of about 5,000 people when I was growing up there in the 70s and 80s. The second picture on my slide is a picture of our county fair called the Buckwheat Festival, which is a very big deal in the end of September for Kingwood and brings a lot of people there. But when I was growing up there in the 70s and 80s, is a very thriving town. It had a lot of industry, including a Kenny shoe plant. We made shoes there. There was a power plant. There was a Shado bronze plant. There was a manganese plant. There were coal mines. There were the railroads that went with that. There was trucking. Now, a lot of this was extractive industry kind of things, but all of that I just described is gone. All of it. And the reason that that's gone is because of extractive and short-term thinking that the industry came in, used up the place, and then left. And so that's what I mean by having that broken relationship with the natural systems and our Earth is those extractive systems that are taking and not giving back and being regenerative. So the town that I remember and the town that I grew up in is like when I first brought my wife to Kingwood the first time, she described it as a Norman Rockwell town, and it was very idyllic. But now it's a dying town, as I described. My dad still lives there, and the only grocery store in town is the Walmart. And so if Walmart corporate decides that this is no longer a profitable store for them, and that closes, that would mean that people of Kingwood would have to go about 25 miles for the closest groceries. And my dad is elderly, and so that would be problematic. Um, and I know probably none of you have ever been to Kingwood, West Virginia, but I know you know many places like it and have seen these small towns have been dying, whether they're farm towns, mining towns, old industry towns. And again, those time and time again, that same story plays out of that extraction of that place and then leaving a very sad place. So I want to share with you my journey to this conclusion that Kingwood is emblematic of our broken relationship and how this relates to climate change. So my slide says my journey to this conclusion and my evolution of thinking. And so what I realized was I've always had an interest in the environment. I probably got every single environmental merit badge in the Boy Scouts when I was in the Boy Scouts. My Eagle Scout project was planting 600 trees at the local high school. In seventh grade, my science fair project was doing water monitoring on the Cheat River, which is just down over the hill from Kingwood. And it was very impacted from acid mine drainage from the history of coal mining. At the time, it was a dead river at the time. It's now come back because of committed local citizens over the last 30 years. And I've always gardened with my mom. So I always had this bent towards the environment, and I've always been drawn to the environment and understand that. And the reason that I bring this up is because it's important to tell our story. And this is my story. This is my story and my journey about this. And you all listening and watching have your own story about this. And so it's important to tell that story because story is how we connect. I say that story sticks. Facts and figures don't stick. So, story is how we relate to each other. And that's why it's important to tell this story. And again, I'm going to talk a little more about that as we go through this. So, the next step in my journey was as an adult, I learned what mountaintop removal was in my home state and the rest of Appalachia. For those of you listening, what we're looking at is a picture from the sky of a mountaintop removal site, which covers probably hundreds, if not thousands, of acres of like what we would describe as a moonscape. All of the trees are gone, all of the dirt's gone, everything's gone except for the rock. And this is how they mine with mountaintop removals. They remove the mountain from the coal, then they take the coal, then they leave basically a moonscape. And when I first learned about this, now this isn't something that is readily available to the public for obvious reasons. Um, but when I learned what mountaintop removal was, I just happened to be having a conversation with my brother, and I just happened to say, "How could anybody think that this is okay? I mean, look at like what this is doing, and it causes flooding, and it causes all these problems." And he lives in southern West Virginia now, and he said, "What? It's fine. It provides coal, it provides jobs, it keeps the lights on, all that." I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe that you think this." And so I was like, "Okay, I'm going to prove you wrong. And here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to learn everything I can learn about mountaintop removal and prove you wrong with facts and figures." And so this went on for several years where like I would like because we lived a few hours apart, like when we came together, I would talk about this and I say, "Well, here's all these problems we have." Like, "Yeah, but what about this? What about this?" Like, now I'm gonna have to learn some more. So I kept learning more and more about mountaintop removal, but then that it expanded even beyond that into other environmental realms as well. And so this ongoing argument with my brother went on for years. And what I learned is that didn't work. And so finally, it got to the point where we both kind of had a reckoning. I said, we can't keep doing this. This is hurting our relationship. Like, this is causing tension in our relationship. And so when we started coming together and talking about what was most important to us for our home state of West Virginia, that's when we started making progress. And that's when things started to change. Um, so it was that finding common ground that really worked in the end. And I'll talk a little more about that here in a little bit. So as I was reading all about all this and about mountaintop removal and about all the environmental problems of the world, as I'm sure many of you have done, is you get pretty sad and depressed and you kind of wonder like, well, what's it all for? I'm like, well, good Lord, I need to do something positive, or else I'm just going to have a breakdown here. So what I did is I started an organization called Green Earth Event Services in Morgantown, West Virginia, where I was living at the time. And so I was doing a lot of, 5Ks, 10Ks, and other races and stuff like that. And I noticed that a lot of water bottles and a lot of things, it was creating a lot of waste from these events. And I thought, well, certainly somebody could do something about this and collect this waste. Well, it turns out it was me. So I decided that I was going to just start setting up stations. And for those of you who can't see my slide, it's a station of like collection boxes, one for compost, one for trash, and then one for recycling. And we collected all that with volunteers, and we would show up and do this for free at events. And so I would bring the compost back to my compost pile in my backyard, and we would take all the recycling to the recycling center, and we did this for about 4 years. I led this for 4 years, and we diverted about 2 tons per year from the waste stream. And there's still a few events that are uh, they're zero waste. Hang on, I need a little water here. Still to this day, and I'm really proud of that. But at the same time, I learned a lot about the broken system about recycling, and recycling truly doesn't work. Ultimately, I felt like I was, sticking my finger in the dike, or I was like trying to hold back the ocean with a sand bucket, because I could have done this for the rest of my life and not made a true dent in the waste that we create. Even in that one town of Morgantown, I couldn't have done it. So I learned a lot in those 4 years, and I was doing something very positive, and it was helping change the social culture around these events and getting event planners to think about, up front, and was one of my goals was up front was to get them to think about what waste they're using to begin with. So rather than just collecting it, is thinking about it on the front end. So I did change the culture, but ultimately I realized, we need systematic change is what we need. Yes, I absolutely should do this. This is a good thing, but ultimately this isn't what's going to change the world. So here's my thesis is climate change must be addressed by these four things, and I'll read these for the folks just listening. So my first point is addressing the underlying issues. So the first point is addressing the underlying issues. Number two is change the mindset by talking to each other and in a productive way. So number two is change the mindset by talking to each other in a productive way. Number three is finding peace in our own lives. And so number three is finding peace in our own lives. And then finally, number four is envisioning a better future. So number four is envisioning a better future. So none of this is going to be fixed. Climate change is not going to be fixed by tinkering with the status quo. And that's why I think that, these 4 points, as I go through them, this is how we're truly going to make some progress on it if we can start doing these kind of things. Um, so again, I want people to stop worrying about which, cup goes in which recycling bin. Yes, again, very important, but that's not the most important thing. So point number one is addressing the underlying issues of climate change. And so for those of you just listening, those underlying issues include inequality, racism, loss of trust in society, loss of responsibility, extractive capitalism, patriarchy, injustice, toxic masculinity, white supremacy. And so these are huge topics that have been bedeviling humanity for a very long time. And so I'm not naive enough to think that these can be solved quickly. But if we approach it in a systematic way, and I'm going to talk a little more about that, we can make some progress on these underlying issues. And I know that like a lot of you are thinking is like, well, these are huge issues. Well, where do we get started? Well, here's some tangible, systematic kind of things that we can do. So the slide says revive and mature our democracy. And so some examples of that are getting rid of the Electoral College, um, fixing voter suppression, getting money completely out of politics, stop gerrymandering, help people envision a better world, address racism, sexism, and colonialism, re-regulate the media and social media, and understanding that nature has rights, tax pollution and other harmful activities, democratize our finance and banking, shrink inequality, and invest in education at all levels and see that as a societal good. And so I just named a whole lot of things that are really big, that are hard to tackle, but and you may be thinking it's too big and it can't be changed, and then you just want to, you know, curl up in a fetal position. It's like, however, here's what I believe, and this is what's on the slide: is any human construct can be changed. All of those things that I described, all human constructs, they all can be changed. Humans created them, they can be changed by humans. And so the way I like to think about that, is just kind of a rule of thumb, is the rest of what's on my slide is life over a bar and then money. So in other words, life always supersedes money. And unfortunately, right now, it's kind of the reverse, is money drives how we make decisions. But if we look at life and think about, as we're making any decision, what's best for life rather than what's best for money, we make very, very different decisions in society and personally as well. And again, you're probably thinking, well, we're going to have to get at least half of society on board with this, to make any change. Not true. So some examples is, and I'll give you one very specific example. And so in the book, Why Civil Resistance Works by Erica Chenoweth, quote, every single nonviolent movement to create political change that received active participation from at least 3.5% of the population succeeded in the 20th century. That's 3.5% active participation for those changes that happened in the 20th century. So only 3.5%. I've seen it 10%. I've seen it as high as 25%, but it is far, far from 50% before we can actually make change. Because if we can get the people that are most involved, people that are listening to this, that you are the ones that are most interested in this topic, and you're the ones that have the ability to be that 3.5% that can make that change. So the incentives are wrong, and we're making decisions based on wrong incentives. So if we can flip that and start making decisions based on life over money. So my second point, for those just listening, on the screen it says, seek first to understand, then to be understood. Stephen R. Covey. I'm sure many of you have read the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Read that many years ago. The second quote I have on there is be curious, not judgmental. Ted Lasso. So a little more contemporary there. I've gotten a lot of the Ted Lasso series recently. But talking about climate change and the underlying issues with your family and friends is the most accessible and important thing that you can do to make a change in the world. So when people say, "Well, there's nothing I can do," this is the number one thing that you can do. You as an individual can do this by talking and telling your story about why it's most important to you and why it matters to you. Going back to my conversation with my brother, once we started talking about why it matters to both of us, that's when we started making progress. Um, so how we think and talk about climate change affects mindset. So that's something else I want to talk about. It can be positive or negative, which affects policy changes and which affects outcomes. So let me give you 2 examples of the power of story. And so there's two very, very big stories in the world. And so two of them are money. The first one is money. So if you think about it, the cash that you have in your pocket or the credit cards you have in your pocket, that's not really worth anything. Like, it's not something that you can eat, not something you can live in. It's just something we have created as a story in our society about that this has value and this is how we exchange goods and services. So I'm not saying it's bad. What I'm saying is, like, this is a story about how we operate our society. So can we make different decisions to operate our society in a more inclusive way? Probably so. The second one is race. And I see this, and this becomes more of a theme as I learn more and more, is race biologically doesn't exist. Although we have told ourselves as a story, individually and collectively, that race matters, but biologically it doesn't exist. So race is a story that we've created as humans to justify horrible things to be done to other humans. And so, if it's that simple when you boil it down to it, maybe that's something that we should be addressing of just saying, like, race doesn't exist to begin with, and that we need to judge people as individuals, not judge them as a group. So, next point I'll make is like, so I was that mindset, going back to the mindset, is I was talking with a friend of mine probably about a year ago or so now, and we were talking about the ways of the world, and as people do, and she said, "Oh well, it could be worse," and I said, "We have got to stop thinking that way. What we have to say instead of it could be worse is it could be better." Because think about that. If you think in your head, like, you say, "Well, it could be worse," what do you automatically go to? You go to the negative things. That's where your mind goes. But if you say, "Well, it could be better," then your mind goes to more positive things. So mindset absolutely matters when we're talking about these kinds of things. And so another example of that is our individual and collective mindset, which is what I was addressing a little bit. So those just listening on the slide, our individual and collective mindset, and abundance mentality versus scarcity mentality. So let me give you an example of what I mean by scarcity mentality. So I'm sure all of you remember at the very beginning of the pandemic in 2020, they told us that there was no more toilet paper, and everybody freaked out and they went to the stores and they bought and they filled up their garages with toilet paper because they were worried that they weren't going to have enough. That's scarcity mentality. But then abundance mentality is gardens. I think about this because, like, I have a garden in our front yard and we get to share the tomatoes, the peaches, the kumquats, the peppers that we grow, and our neighbors share their cherries and other things with us. So this is an abundance mentality. So um, I think people make so many scared, fearful decisions based on the perception of scarcity. And if we start thinking about abundance in our society, again, we start making very different decisions. And so these abundance and scarcity mentalities can be cultivated. And what I mean by that is, I'll give you the example of Native Americans. So they see nature as an abundant place. That's their medicine chest. That's their refrigerator. This is where they get all that they need. So this is abundance. And the Native Americans think about nature as being kin. They talk about the fish people, the tree people, the bug people. So they think about nature as being equal with humans. And I think if we think about um, nature or humans and nature being equal, we make very different decisions. But as far as like the negative scarcity mentality or the negative mentality that can be cultivated, I'll give you two examples. The first one is Lewis Powell, who later became a Supreme Court justice, wrote a memo in 1971 at the behest of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and it said that the American economic system is under broad attack from consumer, labor, and environmental groups. Um, but really, what that was just enforcing the social contract, but what that was the genesis of what we're seeing play out in our society now, where they've created a scarcity mentality and they've pitted different groups against each other. So that was a cultivated scarcity mentality and divide and conquer kind of mentality. The second example I'll give you is from my home state and from Appalachia in general, is back in the 1980s, the coal industry was taking a large hit because they were starting to mechanize. So a lot of people were losing their jobs. There was acid mine drainage. There was acid rain, if some people remember that. And so they were doing, not mountaintop removal quite yet, but they were doing strip mining. So they had a lot of PR problems. So instead of like cleaning up their act, what they did is they created an organization called the Friends of Coal. And what the Friends of Coal does is basically it's a group that supports the coal industry, but it plays itself as supporting coal miners. So it the public perception of this is that it's supporting hardworking miners, but what it truly is propping up the industry to make sure that they can continue doing the horrible things that they were doing to people in the environment. And so it's so entrenched that there's two major universities in the state of West Virginia, and they would play a football game every year, and it was called the Friends of Coal Bowl. And so this was very much entrenched in the culture of the state in particular. And this was also true in Virginia and Ohio and Pennsylvania as well. It wasn't just for West Virginia. But again, this was a cultivated negative or trying to take down a negative stereotype, I guess you could say. So we'll go on to my third point, which is, none of us are going to be any good to anybody if we can't find peace in our own lives. So this is the third point, and on my slide, it says peace in our own lives. And the only way we can bring peace to the earth is to learn to make our own life peaceful. And that's a quote from Buddha. And so I really believe that the change comes from within. And during the pandemic, I grew a lot. I did a lot of work personally on myself, finding more acceptance, empathy, peace, and being able to just let go of some of these things. Um, and so if we can find that peace in our own lives, we're going to be better equipped to show up to help address these big issues that I addressed earlier. And I and this is one of the reasons that I believe social justice is an absolute critical piece for to conquer climate change. Because if we keep making the same decisions based on the same economic system versus a different set of ways we make decisions, life over money, we're going to continue to have the same problems. So, for example, like with the renewable energy industry, so, for example, like, yeah, it's great to have windmills and solar panels, but if it continues to be not supporting people and just propping up corporate profits only, then we're going to continue to have the same problems over and over again. So, and the other thing that I realized too is that good ideas and being able to do good work is very hard to do when you're stressed. And I'm sure we all know that. But I know in my own life that the times when I felt threatened, don't make good decisions, and don't have the capacity for the creativity that we need to solve some of these problems. So the mantra that I use to remind myself of this is, "It mustn't be my fault." And so I'm a big fan of the rock band Rush, and Neil Peart, pictured in my slide with his motorcycle. Um, would ride his motorcycle in between the shows that Rush did, and then he wrote adventure books about his adventures with he and his buddies that rode the motorcycles between these shows. And what he was talking about when he said it mustn't be my fault is he was talking about motorcycle safety. And so what he was really saying is, I'm going to control what I can control and not worry about the rest of it. So if I get hurt or killed, it mustn't be my fault. I mustn't be the one that caused the accident. So yes, bad things can happen, but I shouldn't be the one that causes that. So in other words, doing what I can and within my sphere of influence is that's the comfort level that I feel with that. And so, just to give you some perspective, is I think sometimes people worry about, again, which cup does the thing go in? Should I buy a Tesla? Should I put solar panels on my house? Those kind of things, all important stuff. But if you think about it, if you died tomorrow, how much impact would that have on climate change? So what I'm saying is give yourself a break, about these things. Um, and by the way, the whole personal carbon footprint thing that we all hear about, and like, if you fly, your carbon footprint's this, if you drive this, blah, 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 if you take the train, well, that was invented by BP. And that was invented by BP to put the fault on you, not the producers of the product necessarily. And so how are we going to do this? So my slide says cultivate creativity. We have to envision it to build it. So this is my fourth point, is that if you can't envision it, you can't build it. That's why we have blueprints when we build buildings. We don't just start building a building, we have a blueprint. So what is this going to look like? And different people are going to have different ideas about what the outcome is going to be. So one of the most helpful things that I've found whenever I'm thinking about, how to think differently about something is I ask the question, what if, why not? So I'll give you some examples so you can see what I'm talking about. So asking the question, what if, then why not? So for example, and I've got several of the examples, but I'll just give you a few. So what if everything essential to life cannot be a profit-making venture? Why not create an economic system that looks like that? What if there were no prisons? Why not create a restorative justice system instead? What if nature has rights in the law? Why not ensconce that nature in the law? Um, One final example here. So, what if we integrated scientific and traditional ecological knowledge, which is Native American, TEK is what they call it, traditional ecological knowledge, to make better decisions about nature and how we do restoration? Why not integrate those as we make decisions about how we interact with our natural world? So I really like that mantra of like, what if, why not? Because it can be applied to anything where you're trying to make a change. And this is a way that you can get the other people to quickly see your vision for how something could be better. So thinking about that, excuse me, as you are trying to make some change in the world. So I'll read you my slide here. So for those that are listening, so rebalance society so all may live within Earth's bounds. And then, excuse me, there's a quote from Buckminster Fuller. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And so a lot of times people jokingly say is like, you know, the car was the new model for the horse, and so you built something better. And there's other examples of that out there, but there's other examples of like, you know, like for example, what about regenerative agriculture? So we do agriculture in a particular way for the most part. It's very monoculture, those kinds of things. But what if we had uh, pilot projects that were regenerative agriculture where people could see this is a better model because there's fewer inputs, you get better results, the the earth, the soil is regenerated, those kinds of things. So thinking about like building a different model, providing those pilot projects, again thinking what if, why not? How can you apply that? And so I've said this many times. It's like, unfortunately, the burden of proof is on the people who are proposing change. And that sucks because it's hard, because the status quo is much easier. And that's why it's easier to just kind of go with the flow. But for those of you that are listening and watching, I hope that you are the ones that can not go with the flow and ask those questions of what if, why not, about how things can be different. And I know it works. So if you can return to Kingwood with me or your similar kind of place that you think you've thought about, we're going to do a little exercise here to envision a better future for the place that you're thinking about. And here's where the things that you wrote down that you're concerned about are going to come into play. Um, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read you some brainstormed ideas, thinking about Kingwood and how it could be look very different from what I described earlier. So here we go. I'll just give you a few examples here. So there's plenty of jobs because we are caring for the earth and each other. Schools encourage students to critically think, be creative, and it's okay to be different. Schools are hubs of the community to gather in evenings and weekends. Grocery store is a locally owned and operated co-op that's supplied by local farmers. There's community butchers for farmers and hunters. Um, Homes have been weatherized and solar panels are put up by local workers and retrained extractive industry workers. The city hosts community planning events for feedback and ideas. There's a robust internet so everybody's can be connected to the world. There's local arts and entertainment. And it's all paid for by people paying their fair share and everyone enjoying the benefits of that. The air is cleaner and the water is cleaner, and there's recreational opportunities created from extractive industries like rail trails, for example. And the cultural history of coal and other things are celebrated, and the indigenous cultures from the past are celebrated. And there's a true conversation about the good and the bad of the past and the future. And that we repurpose old buildings to have new life. There's local banks so that we can have local finance, and that's held locally, local responsibility. And so these are just a few examples. I've got many, many other examples, but I can see this version of Kingwood in my mind's eye and how much better that would be and how different my dad's life would be. I could maybe have stayed in my hometown to work there had there been more jobs. And my classmates wouldn't have had to leave. And so it would have just been a more desirable place. Um, so I hope you can, think about some of these things, asking a question, what if, why not, about your place and your um, items of concern as you apply them to, whatever place that you may have. And the reason I say place is because I think sometimes it's easier to think of an issue and put it into a smaller context that we have a connection to, because it's sometimes hard to think about um, the issues in South America or Asia or something like that, because we don't necessarily have a connection there, but we do have a connection to some of these other places where we can see where those benefits can come from. So a final exercise that I'd like you to do is take out those cards that you filled out at the beginning or wrote down or in your phone or whatever, and ask the question about yourself, and maybe do it late now or maybe later, but asking what if, why not about all those things, and create a vision for what you're concerned about. And imagine if we combined all the solutions for everybody on this call, if we can combine all those solutions, like what that would mean to the world. As I think sometimes it's hard to see those positive changes because that's not what makes the news. But there's so many good people, there's so many positive things happening in the world. And I sometimes have to remind my 14-year-old daughter that there are good people in the world, there are good things happening, but you just don't hear about them because that's not what makes the news. So what I want you to do is, so many times you come to a thing like this and you think, oh, good point, and I do this too, like, or read a book or something, you think, oh, that's great, but and then you kind of go on back into the flow of things in the status quo. But here's what I'm suggesting is take those things that you're concerned about and think about it. What are you going to do to address those concerns that you identified that are of most concern to you? What are you going to do today? What are you going to do this week? What are you going to do next month, next year? and write them down and come back to them. Put them on your fridge, put them on your night table, and you'll forget about it from time to time, and that's okay. But just come back to it and think about, how can you make that systematic change? As my goal here is to empower you to do something important that to you that makes a difference in the world, and you can keep it going by finding good work. And the second thing I would say is, so many times when after in the Q&A after this, people say, well, what can I do? I'm just one person. Well, there's two things. There's two things that you can do. One I already mentioned, which is talking to your friends and family about climate change and the things that you've written down and why it's important to you, and telling your story and envisioning that better future. That's number one. And number two is, stop being such an individual. Be part of a group, because you bring power to a group. And if you're trying to do it alone, it's very lonely. I only had like 2 or 3 consistent volunteers with Green Earth Event Services, and it kind of got lonely. But the more people that you can bring into those circles, the better. And that builds community. So those are the two things that you can do, you're as an individual, and it does make a difference. And so as I was having this argument with my brother I came across this cartoon, and I keep coming back to it because I really think it's funny, because I like to have this thought exercise of, like, let's just say, for argument's sake, that fossil fuels don't have any pollution implications. So there's no carbon issue, there's no acid mine drainage, there's no issue with the pollution from fossil fuels, let's just say. Well, here's the problem, is they're a finite resource. They will run out someday. So we will at some point have to change our society, because we can't continue to rely on fossil fuels, even if there weren't any pollution implications for them. And that's the reason that there's hardly any mining left in West Virginia, is because the coal is gone. They've mined it for 150 years, it's gone. They're not making any more. So we do have to change our society one way or the other, regardless. So I'll go to the next slide here. So it's my hope that you come away again from this presentation with a new lens on climate change, and thinking about what you can do individually, and how that can go out into the world and have more exponential um, ripples into the world. So what we talked about is identifying those underlying issues. I identified some really big issues, but they're all human constructs. We can change them. Number two is talking with each other in a in a productive way, and I'll emphasize productive way. And then finding peace in our own lives is number three, so we can show up and be good in society. And then envisioning a better future and helping other people envision that better future. Because if we can't envision it, we're not going to be able to build it. So take that passion that you have, because you showed up to this. I know you have passion, because you decided to spend your time with me today, and I appreciate that. So go join something and take that passion out into the world. And by the way, I know that talking can change the world, because these are solar panels on my brother's farm in West Virginia. And although I don't think he would ever admit it, I think the reason he has solar panels on his farm is from our conversation. So over the years, I think he realized that, like, oh, yes, I need to be doing something about this. And at one point, he actually had a Friends of Coal sticker on the back of his pickup truck. And I said, "What are you doing?" And he shortly thereafter took it off. So I know that just talking can change the world, because he's now showing me his $5 electric bill. And the only reason he has to pay $5 is to stay hooked up to the grid. So for those of you who think that, like, well, it's not really worth it, I know for a fact that there can be tangible um, change from just having a conversation. And so I know you're not going to be able to read all this, or maybe you can. If I know the people listening can't see this, but this is my reading list. So I've got 2 pages here, and these are all books I like to share with folks at this presentation, because these are all books that have really influenced my thinking, and I read quite a bit, and try and triangulate. And that's the way I believe you find truth, is by triangulating and finding a lot of different sources, um, to find out what actually is the truth, and not taking one source for the gospel, as it were. So there's a lot of books here, and maybe there's a way we can share this later on.
Yeah.
Um, but
Let
so
me.
yeah, I'll open it up. However you want to proceed here, I'm
Okay.
more than willing to do conversation, Q&A, whatever you would like to do.
Well, we are actually at our very last minute, and I
Oh,
really appreciate I appreciate how you used up every single one. This will become a podcast and will become available to other people. I want to just mention organization you may be aware of. People want to check it out, like climaterealityproject.org, because they still do trainings, and which definitely inspired you. And thank you so much. We're really out of time, so I just want to thank you. And if you want to just say very quickly how people can reach you, if that's okay, just say an email very quickly because we need to wrap up here.
if you're interested, and again, I'll say, like, I'm only looking for productive conversations and things like that. But my personal email is garthlindley@yahoo.com.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank all the listeners and viewers and our engineer Rebel and our producer Dean Piper, and everyone. Please tune in next Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Talk4TV or w4cy.com. And thank you again so much, Garth Lindley. And may we all have enriching conversations in diversity and climate solutions this week. Thank you.
Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate